Hey guys, for today's lecture, I am going to join you from Pretend from an indigenously built church in Chichicastenango, which is a rural Mayan town out in western Guatemala. I was there back in November and was able to see some of the indigenous rituals done there, which would very much fall under the category of shamanism today. So I thought it would be a great setting for us to talk about this week's topic of discussion, which is the anthropological concept of the witch. So what we're going to do today is talk about how anthropologists talk about witches and think about and study witches in a variety of global contexts. Now, I'm not going to bog you down with a lot of case examples. Rather, what I want to do is talk about some of the terminology that anthropologists use today. So when anthropologists study witches, and witches exist in almost every society, witches are a marker of social tension. In many cases, accusations of witchcraft are actually accusations about social conflict, anxiety, and tension within the group. This shouldn't surprise you. These are the same sets of explanations that we see in the early European example, as well as the Salem witch trials, right? But this applies to anthropological examples outside of the West as well. So witches are markers of social tension. If there's a witch in a community, it means that there are problems in the community in terms of property disputes, jealousy, unequal distribution of disease, thievery, etc. When anthropologists want to study witchcraft and witches, we not only study the rituals and behaviors that witches do, the context that witchcraft is understood within a society, but we also look at the social relationships to understand what's actually being expressed. In most cases, witchcraft accusations are actually about toxic relationships that exist within the community. And so anthropologists focus a lot on the rituals of witchcraft, with the understanding that these rituals serve social functions. They have symbolic values. We already talked about symbolism a little bit and the importance of symbolism in myths and magic, but also symbols are incredibly important in rituals because rituals are the physical actions that reinforce those myths. Rituals reaffirm the order of society. They tell us who is responsible for what, who's in charge of what, how people should behave. They add stability and order to the chaos that is our lives. Now, when we talk about rituals related to witchcraft, we're often talking about magical rituals. These are rituals that include some element of the supernatural realm and therefore have magical items like fetishes in them, or magical speech, or magical practices, divination, things like that. Magical rituals exist in a number of cultures, and we already talked about magical rituals a little bit when we talked about magic in section, but when we view them from the anthropological perspective, we are often talking about rituals that relate to the body or rituals that relate to the life experience, right? So puberty rites, fertility rituals, funerary rituals, rituals of renewal, healing rituals. These are all rituals that deal with the science of body, but when societies don't understand the science of the body, in many cases, we don't really understand the science of the body, and that's why we're going through a lot of magical thinking right now. But when people don't understand the biological anthropology aspects of anthropology, then in many cases, explaining those strange biological happenings is done through magical ritual. This also includes weather magic rites. And these are very, very common rituals which are done to create certain types of weather. So weather magic is highly context dependent. So in order to understand the different types of magical practitioners who do these magical rituals, we have to learn a little bit of vocab just so that we're all using the same terms and meaning the same things when we talk about various contexts. So the first of these types of practitioners are mediums, and mediums are individuals who can contact the spirit world. Therefore, they're kind of the middlemen. That's why they're mediums, right? In the middle of a seance, are able to connect to spiritual beings. This can be done in a variety of ways, but usually is done in a state of trance. So there is some kind of ritual context in which the person who is trying to speak to the spiritual world goes through a series of ritual events, gets into a hyper trance state. This is slightly different than diviners. A diviner can use supernatural means to see the future. In some cases, diviners simply can see the future, and we have examples of that from myths, for example, the Cassandra myth. But in most cases, from the anthropological perspective in the modern era, diviners use supernatural tools. And diviners exist in a lot of cultures. Diviners are individuals who, for example, may use special herbs or special natural objects in order to figure out what the weather's going to be. Should we plant now? Should we not plant now? Diviners are able to use astrological signs and astrological calendars in order to predict future supernatural events. When I was in Southeast Asia and I was in the Chinese world, that includes places like Hong Kong, Singapore, places with Chinese diaspora like Malaysia, and then of course China itself. Chinese folk religion includes a lot of divination. There's a common practice in Chinese folk temples. This was something I experienced when I went to Hong Kong, where you have a series of sticks, each with a number on them, and they're placed in a cup. And you think about your life, you shake the sticks, and whichever number comes out first, there's a giant wall of basically little drawers with those stick numbers on them, and you pull out the drawer that matches your stick number, and there's a fortune inside, and you read the fortune and it applies to your life. So diviners can be both supernatural practitioners who use divination in order to predict the future, but in many religions there is actually an aspect of divination where you, the average person, get to be a witch for a little while and divine the future through these supernatural means. In addition, healers, as we talked about with the early modern Europe example, are often considered to be witches. And so healers are a whole class of people who do witchcraft. In many cases, it's that they understand basic herbology. They understand things like midwifery. So they understand the healing arts. And so they're classified as witches. But in many societies, this isn't necessarily seen as a wholly negative thing. If you wrong them, they may spite you with a dangerous curse, or if you do the right thing and make them happy, they may heal you in all sorts of different ways. In addition, there are lots of witches who can be hired in societies to do healing positively, but also to cause disease. Also, throughout the world, we have shamans. Now, shamans are part-time religious practitioners. In other words, they're not priests who are full-time religious practitioners, but rather shamans are often people who have other roles in the community. They may be leaders, they may be powerful agriculturalists, they may be artisans. In many cases, they are artists and make music, perform dance, perform other ritual art making. But part of the time they work as shamans, and they are really representatives of the community. So they have a leadership position and they enter the spirit world. Now, sometimes they can be mediums. That means a spirit actually talks through them. In other cases, they just interact with the spiritual world in a variety of different ways, but they do so for group benefit. So these are not quite witches. These shaman are positive. The issue is that they're often cast as witches when other members of the community don't like the messages that they have to say, or when members outside the community don't understand what they do. So in many cases, and you guys will watch a couple of examples of this in videos for this week, you have shamans of indigenous communities who are highly respected within their community, but then outsiders view them as witches. And so they get titled as witches. So a lot of times when anthropologists are studying witchcraft in the field, what they're actually looking at are shamans who are well respected within their own communities, but those communities are miscast or misunderstood by others. And then finally, I just wanted to throw this in there. This is something that is important in witchcraft, but witches are often associated with material culture. These can include offerings that witches make to other spirits. So you make an offering and the idea is that you're going to get something back. In many cases, offerings are made, for example, to the ancestors, purely for protection. And that's an important part of witchcraft in a number of societies around the world. You begin to be bewitched by evil spirits because your ancestors haven't received enough offerings from you, and therefore your ancestors are not able to protect you. So offerings are sometimes made in the process of witchcraft, but offerings can also be made to counterbalance witchcraft. And of course, we talked a little bit about magical language. Prayers are an example of magical speech, and prayers can actually be said out loud or they can be thought. Prayers are also used in a collective environment in order to create communitas, in order to create social bonding. In addition, witchcraft is often associated with sacrifices, which are physical offerings that you make in order to request something, but you are giving up something that you want. So in many cases, if we as anthropologists want to understand witchcraft in a society, we are looking at the social tensions that are there, and then we're looking at the rituals that are built up in order to release those social tensions and bring the group back together. In other words, as anthropologists, we look at the magical rituals that are done, but we don't view them as magical or beyond our comprehension. We understand the cultural ramifications, the biological ramifications. I'll talk about this a little bit in section, but we understand the concept of witchcraft as more than just myth and story, but as something that affects people's lives very realistically in the world today. All right, everyone, thanks for listening. Hopefully you can keep this vocabulary in mind because it's the kind of vocabulary that we're going to use for the rest of the semester to not only talk about witches, but also when we get into some of our examples of metamorphs and vampires and other monsters from the anthropological perspective, this vocabulary will really help you out. Thanks so much for listening.